All right, this course is IB History of the Americas. So we want to look outside the U.S. repeatedly, and we're going to talk about Canada in the Gilded Age, and we're going to come back to Canada after that. So before we start all that, we need to have some backstory about the development of Canada up to the point of the Gilded Age. That's what these next two lectures are about. Now, present-day Canada, which by the way, it won't be called Canada for a long, long time, was essentially the colony of New France. And New France began with explorations in the 16th century with people like Jacques Cartier and Samuel de Champlain. During the 150 years of New France's existence, approximately 10,000 immigrants came there, mostly from France, almost all Catholic, as Louis XIV decreed. He was firmly Catholic. He ruled one king, one law, one faith. He was an absolute monarch and a fervent proponent of the Catholic Church. That's not that many immigrants, 10,000 over the course of 150 years, but life in New France was difficult. There were lots of Indian attacks and bitter cold, but it was driven by predominantly the fur trade. The heart of New France was a ribbon of settlement along the St. Lawrence River, from Quebec in the north, which was founded in 1608 by Samuel de Champlain, to Montreal further south. Montreal was established in 1642, although the site was originally found by Jacques Cartier in 1542. New France also included various settlements on the Atlantic. These would be known as the Maritime Colonies, or later Maritime Provinces. This Acadian Peninsula, which is present-day Nova Scotia, was the source of a number of settlements as well. Now, in 1670, England chartered something called the Hudson Bay Company to compete with the French in the fur trade. It was founded to exploit the trade in the northern interior, accessed by Hudson's Bay. Of course, it was founded by the English explorer Henry Hudson in 1610. It was very difficult. It was very limited settlement. It was very hard. You were cut off all winter by ice, but eventually it was successful. The French caught on to this, however, and also competed. So initially, Hudson Bay had limited settlements focused on the fur trade and included both French and English competitors. In addition to fur, the really great economic benefits of Canada were cod, fishing, and long before settlement had occurred, Europeans knew about these massive concentrations of cod known as the Grand Banks surrounding Newfoundland, the island of Newfoundland. And so seasonal fishing camps would set up there to dry the cod. We see a drying rack there. And gradually these temporary seasonal developments became permanent settlements, but it was slow. The French dominated this, but the English also had a part, and they tried to drive the English away. The French did, but they weren't entirely successful. So as with Hudson's Bay, this sparsely settled economic enterprise involved both French and English competing with each other. One last but important element of New France was the Mississippi River Valley. In 1682, René Robert Cavelier de La Salle sailed from the Great Lakes Basin down to the Gulf of Mexico along the Mississippi and declared the entire valley for his sovereign Louis XIV. So theoretically, New France is a giant place stretching from Newfoundland all the way down to the center part of the continent and down to the Gulf of Mexico via the Mississippi. In reality, it was far less populated than the English colonies on the Atlantic coast, but in geography it was huge. Now, from the 1660s to the 1760s, there were a series of wars between European powers that continually affected the Americas, mostly at the expense of France and to the benefit of England, later in that era the UK. Now, the first of these wars was from 1665 to 1667. It's called the Second AngloDutch War. That's not that important, but importantly, it did transfer New Holland to England as New York, and therefore makes England a little bit more powerful, and necessarily France perhaps a little less powerful on the North American continent. Here we see James, the Duke of York, the brother of the King of England, for whom New York was named after. He will later become James II, although he'll be deposed. The next war was named, in North America at least, King William's War, after King William III. James II was removed from the throne of England, and the English invited his daughter Mary and her husband Prince William of Orange from the Netherlands to come rule England. France declared war as a result of this, replacing this Catholic James II, which is why they got rid of him, with the Protestant William of Orange. The war, in terms of America, was inconclusive. In fact, some New Englanders captured some forts in Acadia, and the French, this was a world war, the French captured Madras in India, and so the New Englanders were furious when the peacemakers gave France back the forts in Acadia, and the French gave back Madras to England. So in the Americas, no net effect. Queen Anne was the successor of William and Mary, and the next war, 1702 to 1713, is known as Queen Anne's War. In Europe, it was known as the War of the Spanish Succession. It went badly for the French in Europe, which ultimately ended up in the Treaty of Utrecht, 1713. And here were the terms. The French abandoned Hudson's Bay. Remember, they competed there with the English. They left it totally to the English. They also abandoned Newfoundland. They competed with the English there. They left it totally to the English. Some New Englanders had raided and taken forts in Acadia, as they had in the previous war, and these would remain English as Nova Scotia, New Scotland. So the French, they did retain some maritime colonies on the former Acadia, but much of it was now Nova Scotia. So this was clearly a setback for the French. The next war was King George's War, 1744 to 1748, named after George II. In Europe, this was known as the War of the Austrian Succession. George II, of course, spoke very little English and spent most of his time in Germany. There was no net effect change in America. However, after these setbacks, maybe it did sort of have an effect because French governors began to get very aggressive and began a policy of building roads and forts in the Ohio River Valley. This was very provocative toward the British, and they responded with force. Sent a guy named George Washington, a very young man who was captured by the French, ultimately released, and this will translate into the next Great War. The 7 Years' War, 1755 to 1762, another global war between England and France. In the Americas, it was known as the French and Indian War. And the culminating and important event here was in 1759 when General Wolfe, the English general, defeated the Marquis de Montcalm, the French general, and captured Quebec, the capital of New France. There's a very famous painting here of the death of Wolfe. Both Wolfe and Montcalm were killed, but the English win. And the conclusion is basically the French lose their northern colonies. They're basically kicked out of North America. The UK gets what is present-day Canada, and Louisiana is given to Spain as compensation for being French allies. France is permitted to retain some sugar islands. Guadeloupe and Saint Martinique today they're not colonies of France, they're actual départements of France. But by and large, the 7 Years' War means the French are no longer in North America. Now, this is important. The French of North America and the French of France are now severed. The Canadians, as they're known, the French in North America, they will become subjects of the British Crown, but culturally they will remain French. Now, this war brings up two very important issues that will have great impact on the development of North America, especially in regard to British North America, Canada. Britain was left with two questions. Number one, how to incorporate Catholics into the Protestant Empire. These French people were Catholics, and the British Empire was inherently Protestant. Secondly, so religion is an issue. Secondly, how do we pay for the staggeringly expensive war we just fought, and how do we continue to pay for the ongoing maintenance of such a large North American empire? So taxation, religious and taxation, important issues. Religion won't be such an issue for the 13 colonies. Taxation certainly will, but both issues will have repercussions for the development of Canada. So at the end of the French and Indian War, Canada, now British North America, really consists of about 4 parts. First, Quebec. 2 colonies, really, a fishery and a commercial enterprise. One of the colonies is Quebec, although it's called a province because it is governed by an appointed governor and an appointed council. It does not have an elected assembly. We don't want to give the French-speaking Catholics that much power. Nova Scotia, however, which absorbed the former French Maritime Colonies, was given an appointed governor and an elected assembly, much like the southern colonies. There was also one fishery, Newfoundland, which was really more than a fishery but less than a colony, and one commercial enterprise, the Hudson Bay Company territories, which were large but again sparsely settled and mostly just economic. The British pretty quickly got comfortable quietly tolerating Catholicism, giving tacit permission to Canadians to pursue their religion, and in fact that was necessary to win their acquiescence, just to get things done. But this was not unusual for the British. It was not unlike Ireland, which they ruled, predominantly Irish, or the Scottish Highlands, for example. They publicly decried papism, but privately let it flourish. Now, the final war I want to talk about, obviously, is the War for American Independence, 1775 to 1783. George Washington authorized the invasion of Quebec, which, along with Nova Scotia, would, he hoped, become the 14th and 15th colony to join the rebellion, but it was just not to be. The British imperial forces, together with the Canadian militia, pretty handily repelled the Americans. One thing that happened during the war that's not much talked about from an American perspective is something called the 1778 Declaratory Act. I wrote 1878. That's wrong. 1778. The war was not going well, and the British Parliament decides, well, you know what? We're gonna try and win the colonies back by saying, okay, you win. We're not going to tax you at all. So the act said that it basically conceded the right of taxation of colonies. Henceforth, taxes raised in the colonies were to be spent in the colonies and not appropriated for imperial purposes. This would be a founding principle for a renovated empire and for a Canada in the future, but was too late, obviously, to retrieve the 13 colonies. But it's something we'll talk about. It's very important for the colonies after the Revolution. And one reason Britain retains Canada. Major consequence for Canada of the war was about 80,000 Americans, loyalists, were dispossessed and became refugees. About half went to England or elsewhere in the empire, but about half went to Quebec and Nova Scotia and were given land and money by the crown. They became a sudden majority in some areas of those provinces, and they brought their very American attitudes with them. And so Americans and American attitudes will be part of the mix that will form what is present-day Canada.